January 30th, 1968. Saigon, South Vietnam. The air over Saigon is heavy and damp, thick with the smell of gasoline and distant rain. It is the eve of Tet, the Lunar New Year, a time for prayers, family reunions, and brief peace. U.S. soldiers at Ton Son Nhut Air Base joke that maybe, just maybe, the war has taken a holiday. The city hums with false calm. Street vendors pack up their carts, firecrackers pop in the alleys, and American patrols slow their pace. Inside a small billet near Chelan, Sergeant James Walker of the 716th Military Police Battalion leans back on his cot, flipping through a letter from home. His buddy, Ruiz, is already asleep, boots still on. The radio crackles with late-night static, Armed Forces radio playing faint country tunes between bursts of news. Then, at 2:47 a.m., everything changes. The first explosions tear through the silence like thunder. A wall of sound swallows the city. Gunfire, RPGs, and the crack of mortars. Walker jumps to his feet as tracer rounds slash across the night sky. The airbase's sirens begin to howl. "Jesus, they're inside the wire!" Ruiz yells, grabbing his M16. Across Saigon, Viet Cong units, long thought crushed and disorganized, are emerging from the shadows. Dressed as civilians, they pour from trucks and taxis, hitting police stations, radio towers, and the U.S. Embassy itself. Within minutes, the heart of American command is under siege. At the embassy compound, guards exchange fire through shattered glass. A Viet Cong sapper throws a grenade that detonates against the main gate, blowing open a hole in the perimeter wall. Smoke fills the courtyard as Marines scramble to respond. Inside the control center at MACV, General William Westmoreland receives the first reports. Attacks in Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, and Kon Tum. More than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam are under simultaneous assault. The Tet holiday, meant for rest and renewal, has become the stage for the most audacious operation of the Vietnam War. By dawn, Saigon burns. Civilians run barefoot through streets littered with glass and bodies. The orange glow of fire reflects off the black helmets of U.S. MPs as they push block by block, retaking the city. Over the radio, one phrase repeats, disbelief turning into grim understanding. This is it. The Tet Offensive has begun. January 31st, 1968. Hue, Central Vietnam. The Perfume River runs dark and silent beneath the morning fog. On its banks, the ancient imperial city of Hue, once a quiet symbol of culture and serenity, now trembles beneath the sound of artillery. The first shells fall without warning, shattering the stillness that had survived for centuries. Inside the citadel, monks scramble to protect temple relics, while families flee through the narrow streets, clutching whatever they can carry. The North Vietnamese Army, the 324B Division, has infiltrated the city with surgical precision. In a matter of hours, Hue falls almost entirely under communist control. For the first time in the war, the Viet Cong and NVA plant their red and blue liberation flag atop the ancient walls of the imperial fortress. Across the river, the U.S. 1st Marine Division and elements of the ARVN 1st Division gather in disbelief. Captain Ronald Christmas, leading Gulf Company, stares through his binoculars at the city skyline, now veiled in smoke. They took the whole damn city. We're going to have to fight for every street. At 900 hours, the Marines move out. What follows is a battle unlike anything seen in Vietnam before. Urban combat, house to house, room to room. The ornate pagodas and French villas of Hue become killing zones. Machine gun fire echoes off stone courtyards. Snipers nest inside church towers. Civilians hide in cellars, praying the front line will pass over them. Marines crawl through alleys littered with rubble and shattered roof tiles. Each advance costs lives measured in meters. Every courtyard cleared reveals another ambush waiting beyond the wall. The city becomes a maze of smoke, blood, and fear. By the fifth day, entire neighborhoods are leveled. Rain turns the streets into rivers of mud and ash. Corpsmen drag the wounded through flooded alleys, their boots sinking into the clay. You don't see the enemy, one Marine later recalls, just the flash of a rifle and the man beside you going down. Inside the citadel, communist forces set up command posts, hospitals, and firing positions within ancient temples. The line between sacred and tactical vanishes. The air fills with the smell of incense and gunpowder. Meanwhile, journalists embedded with the Marines, including Walter Cronkite's CBS crew, record every moment. Their cameras capture the faces of exhausted soldiers, the burned-out ruins, and the stunned civilians wandering amid the wreckage.
Those images will soon reach living rooms across America and begin to change the war itself. As February approaches, Hue becomes a graveyard. Over 10,000 civilians are dead or missing. Both armies fight like ghosts in a city that no longer belongs to the living. And yet, amid the destruction, one truth becomes clear. The Tet Offensive is no longer just a military battle. It is now a psychological war, one that neither side will ever see the same way.
Early morning, January 31st, 1968. Saigon, South Vietnam. The city that had once seemed untouchable now shakes under the sound of gunfire. In the center of Saigon, the U.S. Embassy, symbol of American power and prestige, has been breached. At 2:45 a.m., a small truck packed with Viet Cong commandos disguised as ARVN MPs stopped outside the main gate. One guard had barely lifted his rifle when the explosion came, a shaped charge that blew a gaping hole through the compound wall. Smoke and dust billowed through the courtyard. 18 guerrillas stormed inside, their footsteps pounding across the tiled garden paths. Inside the building, U.S. Marines scrambled for cover. A handful of security men, many unarmed, seized M16s and pistols and returned fire through shattered windows. The radio call went out across the city. Embassy under attack. Repeat, embassy under attack. Helicopters thundered in from Tan Son Nhat Air Base, their rotors slicing through smoke as tracers lit up the sky. Sirens screamed across Saigon, the streets alive with confusion, rumor, and panic. For 6 hours, the world's most secure diplomatic compound became a battlefield. Commandos in black pajamas and rubber sandals fought room to room against Marines in body armor. Grenades echoed through the courtyard. Fragments of marble statues and palm trees littered the embassy lawn. Outside the walls, journalists gathered, cameras ready. Among them was Peter Arnett of the Associated Press, crouched behind a jeep, his lens capturing the chaos. When dawn broke, he photographed a body sprawled beneath the embassy gate, a Viet Cong fighter, barefoot, rifle still clutched in his hand. The image would appear in newspapers across the globe within hours. By morning, the U.S. reinforcements regained control. All the attackers were dead or captured, but the damage was done. Not to the building, but to America's illusion of progress. In Washington, officials stared in disbelief at the headlines. Viet Cong storm U.S. Embassy. Even though the attack failed militarily, its psychological impact was seismic. The enemy had struck at the very heart of American power. Not in the jungle, not in a distant province, but in Saigon itself. Across the city, fighting raged on. At the national radio station, another group of guerrillas attempted to broadcast a victory message before being overrun. At Tan Son Nhat, mortar rounds cratered the runways. Even the presidential palace came under fire. From his headquarters, General Westmoreland issued an order that would echo in history. The enemy has committed all-out aggression. We will not yield a single inch. But the images on television told a different story. Exhausted Marines crouched behind burning trucks, medics carrying bloodied civilians through the streets, journalists describing chaos instead of control. For the first time, the American public saw the Vietnam War not through victory reports, but through the camera's lens. And what they saw looked nothing like victory. By nightfall, Saigon was secure again, but something irreversible had begun, not in the battlefields of Vietnam, but in the living rooms of America. The war was about to lose its audience.
February 1968, Washington, D.C., and across the United States. For years, Americans had been told that victory in Vietnam was within reach. The enemy, officials said, was on the verge of collapse. But now, through flickering television screens, they saw something entirely different. On the evening news, Walter Cronkite, the most trusted voice in America, stared solemnly into the camera. Behind him rolled footage of Saigon in ruins, smoke curling from the embassy courtyard, soldiers crouched behind shattered cars, civilians crying amid rubble. Cronkite's voice, usually calm and steady, carried an undertone of disbelief. It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. In homes across the United States, silence filled living rooms. For the first time, many Americans realized that the government's optimism had been a lie. The Tet Offensive, though a tactical failure for the communists, had won something far more powerful: the war for perception. At the White House, President Lyndon B. Johnson listened to the latest casualty reports in grim silence. Over 4,000 Americans had been killed or wounded since January 30th. The enemy had struck across 100 cities. Even though the attacks had been repelled, the political damage was catastrophic. They said we were winning, one congressman fumed during a hearing. Then how did the enemy get inside Saigon? Outside, anti-war protests swelled. At the University of Wisconsin, students marched with banners reading, "Bring them home." In Chicago, demonstrators clashed with police under cold February skies. Coffins draped in flags appeared on courthouse steps. Mothers wrote letters to the president demanding to know why their sons were dying for cities that fell overnight and were retaken the next day. In Vietnam, American soldiers began to feel the weight of that disillusionment. Letters from home grew angrier, shorter. "Everyone back here says it's pointless. They say we're fighting ghosts." At Khe Sanh, Marines under siege listened to Armed Forces radio playing news of Tet and felt abandoned. It's not just the enemy we're fighting anymore, it's the whole world that thinks we've already lost. Meanwhile, in Hanoi, communist leaders celebrated a paradoxical victory. Though the Tet Offensive had cost them tens of thousands of soldiers, it had achieved what years of combat could not. It shattered America's will to continue. Back in Washington, President Johnson confided to an aide, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." 2 months later, on March 31st, 1968, Johnson stepped before the cameras. His voice trembled slightly as he said the words that marked the beginning of the end for America's war in Vietnam. "I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." The Tet Offensive had not just changed the war, it had changed the nation itself. The trust between the American people and their government was gone. And from that moment on, victory in Vietnam was no longer measured in ground gained, but in time left before withdrawal.
Spring-summer 1968, South Vietnam. The smell of burned powder and wet jungle still lingers over Vietnam. The Tet Offensive has ended, but its echoes continue. In every shattered village, every field pockmarked with craters, and every soldier's face that now shows the same wary disbelief as those watching from across the Pacific. For General William Westmoreland, the commander who once promised light at the end of the tunnel, the light has gone out. He stares at new intelligence reports from Hue. The city retaken, but at terrible cost. Over 80% of Hue lies in ruins, its temples blackened, its riverbanks lined with bodies. Among the dead are not just soldiers, but thousands of civilians executed during the communist occupation. In a letter home, one Marine writes, quote, "We won back Hue one block at a time, but when it was over, there was nothing left to win." Across the countryside, the illusion of control unravels. Entire ARVN units, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, crumble under renewed attacks. Villages once declared secure are found to be riddled with Viet Cong tunnels. At night, distant flares light up the horizon like lightning, followed by the thump of artillery and the low whine of helicopters circling overhead. To the American soldier in the field, the message from Washington that the war is still winnable sounds hollow. Patrols move through ghost villages where only dogs remain, every rice paddy feels like a trap, every smiling villager might be an enemy. In Saigon, the U.S. Embassy wall has been rebuilt, but its cracks remain symbolic. Photographers capture diplomats stepping carefully around bullet holes still visible in the marble facade. Reporters file stories titled, "The War That Won't End." Back home, the anti-war movement grows louder. College campuses erupt in protest. Vietnam veterans recently returned march in uniform with medals pinned to their chests, but upside down. Their chants fill the streets of Washington. "Hell no, we won't go." The American flag waves above the crowds, but for the first time it feels divided, half raised in pride, half lowered in grief. In the jungles near the Laotian border, Captain Thomas Riley leads a platoon of paratroopers on a search mission.
His radio crackles with distant orders: keep pressure, show progress. But progress is now measured in survival. Riley stares at the horizon, where smoke curls from the mountains, and mutters, "They don't understand. We can take every hill and still lose the country." He's right. The Tet Offensive has turned the tide, not because of its military outcome, but because it exposed a truth no government could hide: that the war's greatest enemy was not the Viet Cong, but belief itself. By the year's end, troop morale falters. American strategy shifts from victory to Vietnamization. Washington talks of peace with honor. But every soldier knows what those words mean: that the war is slowly being handed back to those who will bleed for it the longest. The jungles are quiet again by autumn, but it is not peace. It is exhaustion, the sound of a war realizing it has already ended, even if no one will admit it yet.
1969-1970. Saigon, Washington, and the Mekong Delta. The guns still fire in Vietnam, but the meaning has changed. The Tet Offensive is over, yet its shadow stretches across every jungle trail and White House briefing room. The war that was once fought for victory is now fought for exit. In Saigon, General Creighton Abrams, who has replaced Westmoreland, inherits a command haunted by disillusionment. He walks the corridors of MACV headquarters, past maps covered in red pins marking pacified zones that never stay pacified for long. When he asks his aides for a progress report, one officer replies dryly, "Sir, we are winning the same villages we won last month." In Washington, President Richard Nixon faces a nation that no longer believes. The streets roar with protest, students, veterans, even clergy, carrying signs that read, "End the war now and bring them home." The televised hearings in Congress replay footage from Hue, Saigon, and the embassy siege, each image peeling away another layer of official optimism. The cameras that once glorified war now expose it. Journalists ride in helicopters with troops, their lenses capturing mud, fear, and faces too young to understand why they're dying. In one widely published photo, an American medic kneels over a wounded comrade, blood soaking through his fatigues. The caption reads simply, "Quang Tri, 1969. The home front fractures further when reports emerge of the My Lai massacre, where U.S. soldiers killed hundreds of civilians in a single village. For many Americans, it confirms what Tet had already revealed, that the war's moral center had collapsed. In Hanoi, the North Vietnamese study every protest and every headline. To them, Tet proved that victory need not come from the battlefield, only from patience. As one Politburo memo states, "The Americans have the watches, but we have the time." The fighting continues, relentless but hollow. Bombers strike the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Helicopters ferry troops to firefights that end where they began. Each operation has a name, a plan, and a press release, yet none can change the truth that the war's momentum is gone. In the Mekong Delta, Sergeant Michael Reeves of the 9th Infantry crouches in a muddy rice paddy, rain dripping from his helmet. He lights a cigarette with shaking hands. We're not fighting for victory anymore. We're just fighting not to be the last ones to die here. By 1970, American forces begin to withdraw. Vietnamization, the handover of combat duties to South Vietnamese troops, becomes official policy. On paper, it sounds like a strategy. On the ground, it feels like abandonment. At night, the jungle hums as it always has. The glow of flares still lights the horizon. But beneath the noise, the truth is unmistakable. The Tet Offensive ended more than a battle. It ended belief. The world has changed since those 11 days in 1968, but the war continues out of momentum, not conviction. The soldiers fight, the politicians talk, the cameras roll, and somewhere, in the echo of every explosion, lies the question that haunts both sides. What happens when a superpower realizes it cannot win?
1971, 1973, Saigon, Hanoi, and Washington. The war now moves like a shadow, slower, quieter, yet more uncertain than ever. American troop transports line the runways at Tan Son Nhut, their silver hulls gleaming beneath tropical rain. Helicopters lift off in waves, carrying men who no longer believe in what they're leaving behind. In Saigon, President Nguyen Van Thieu tries to project confidence. His speeches promise that South Vietnam will stand alone, fortified by American training and firepower. Yet even as he speaks, the roads leading out of the Mekong Delta are filled with refugees. Villagers push carts loaded with furniture and children. The countryside, once scarred by the Tet Offensive, now bleeds in slow motion. Across the Pacific, President Richard Nixon declares peace with honor. The Paris Peace Accords are signed in January 1973. On paper, the war is over, but everyone knows it is only a truce between exhaustion and inevitability. For Hanoi, it is a pause to rebuild. For Washington, it is a desperate attempt to forget. American soldiers leave Vietnam as quietly as they came. Bases are stripped bare, runways left cracked and silent. On the last day before departure, Sergeant Reeves from the 9th Infantry walks through his old barracks one final time. He looks at the graffiti carved into the walls, names, hometowns, jokes, prayers. Most of those names, he realizes, will never read them again. When his transport lifts off, he glances down through the window. The land that once looked like an enemy now feels like a ghost. Patches of jungle, rivers glinting in sunlight, and somewhere far below, the outline of a burned village. He whispers, almost to himself, "We're leaving, but the war isn't." In Hanoi, the air defense crews that once brought down B-52s stand at ease. Their uniforms are worn, their faces older, but their eyes still carry the fire of endurance. They clean their launchers, reload, and wait. Peace for them feels like the quiet before another storm. By 1974, the illusion of peace collapses. Without U.S. air support and funding, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, begins to fracture. Desertions rise, ammunition runs short. North Vietnamese divisions, once bloodied, return stronger than ever. In March 1975, the final offensive begins. Tanks roar down Highway 1, the same road used by convoys during Tet. The cities of Ban Ma Thuot, Pleiku, and Da Nang fall in rapid succession. Panic spreads south like wildfire. Refugees swarm the roads, clutching bags and crying children. As the North Vietnamese advance, Saigon becomes a city of whispers. Helicopters buzz constantly over the embassy roof, ferrying diplomats and frightened allies. On April 29th, the last American combat personnel board their choppers. The next morning, tanks bearing the red flag crashed through the gates of the presidential palace. The war that began with an illusion of control ends in chaos and silence. No speeches, no victory parade, just the heavy whir of departing rotor blades and the muffled sobs of those left behind. Tet had started it, the unraveling of faith, the slow collapse of purpose. 7 years later, the final scene plays out exactly as that first morning in 1968 had foreshadowed. The enemy inside the walls. And as the North Vietnamese flag rises over Saigon, one truth stands eternal. Wars are not lost in the jungles where they are fought, but in the hearts of those who no longer believe in them.
Saigon, years later, and America, decades after. The war is over, but Vietnam still breathes it. The streets of Ho Chi Minh City, renamed from Saigon, hum with life now. Motorbikes, laughter, the smell of street food rising into a sky once split by tracer fire. Yet beneath that everyday rhythm lies memory, faint, persistent, indelible. In the old quarter of Hue, moss creeps across the citadel's walls, softening the bullet holes that still scar its stones. Tourists walk where soldiers once crawled. Vendors sell incense near the perfume river, unaware that beneath the soil lie the bones of thousands who died during those 26 days of fighting in 1968. At the War Remnants Museum, black and white photos hang in rows, Marines wading through flooded streets, civilians clutching their children, monks kneeling beside craters. The captions are short, but the eyes in the photos say everything. Fear, exhaustion, defiance. For Vietnam, the Tet Offensive became both tragedy and triumph. Proof that a small nation, through will and sacrifice, could endure the fury of a superpower. It cost them dearly, over 45,000 killed, tens of thousands wounded, whole cities burned. But it shifted the balance of history. For America, Tet marked the beginning of doubt. It revealed a truth larger than any battlefield.
that strength cannot sustain a war once belief is gone. The United States won nearly every engagement of Tet militarily, yet lost the one war that mattered most, the war for public faith. In classrooms, historians call it a turning point. Veterans call it something else, the day we realized the jungle was never the real enemy. Television brought the war into every American home. Body bags, burning villages, children screaming in the smoke. And once seen, it could never be unseen. In a quiet cemetery in Arlington, the graves of those who fought in Hue, Khe Sanh, and Saigon stretch in perfect rows. A veteran in a faded green jacket kneels to place a folded flag against a headstone. He whispers, "We were young. We did what we thought was right." But Tet changed everything. Half a world away in Vietnam, a former NVA soldier tends to a small shrine by the roadside. He lights incense, bows, and looks toward the horizon where jungle meets sky. "We were all just trying to go home," he says. 50 years later, the echoes of that offensive remain in history books, in films, in the uneasy silence between nations. Tet was not the end of the Vietnam War, but the moment it began to unravel. It showed the world that the power of conviction could outlast the power of machines, and that wars are fought not only with bullets, but with endurance, faith, and the will to survive the impossible. The guns have long since fallen silent, but in every place where the earth still bears the scars of 1968, you can almost hear it, the whisper of that fateful night. The city sleeps under humid night air, until distant gunfire cracks the silence.